most dominant bears. He's used his adaptability and wisdom to remain successful despite the rigors of age and competition. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Fitz. I am the resident naturalist with explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. Bear 856 is the subject of today's Drawn to Explore program. This is our series of art-themed programs through which we hope you'll use your creativity and love of nature to explore the world. We'll be using pencil for our program today, different types of pencils, and to lead us through this process is Sara Wolman, who is an artist and designer and helps us with a lot of things on Explore. So thanks a lot, Sara, for being here. Great to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited about this particular project because I'm also an 856 fan. Today we're going to be using graphite to draw Bear 856 and explore kind of how shadow and posture and form can express not just like what a bear looks like, but about his general presence and what he can become. So we are going to be using a few different materials for this today. So when I say graphite, I'm not just talking about just a regular pencil, which you of course can use, but there's a few things that will be needed. Drawing paper, again, I'm a big fan of Bristol paper, but that's just because it's smooth, it's flowy. Graphite pencils, so they range, and I think if you have tuned in before and seen some of our previous ones, there are the H's and the B's. The H's are the hard leads, and then the B's are more of the soft leads. So I like to use a range of them because we are going to be doing a lot of like layering. That's really helpful when it comes to graphite, especially with detail. We have some charcoal pencils if needed. In this sketch particularly, I only used it a very little bit, but it's just kind of something to have on the side too, because they give kind of like an extra emphasis, like with the really dark pigment that they provide. There will be white charcoal if you want for details, a kneaded eraser, which is one of my favorites just because it's like mushy and like fun to play with. A blending stump or tissue even. You don't have to have all these things. And there will also be the photo reference that will be available on screen of Bear 856 from, I think Naomi is actually the one that took this one.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So Naomi Boak from
yeah.
the Katmai Conservancy took that photo. It's from a few years ago, but it's a great photo of 856 in September from 2020. And I did post this photo as a pinned comment. So if you're watching this on explore.org right now, it should be in the pinned comment if you scroll down below the camera or the video window. And then also if you're watching on YouTube right now, just ask a moderator for the link to this reference photo if you want to use it today. And if you want to ask us questions as well, probably not me because I don't really know what I'm doing. But if you want to ask
You know
Sara
plenty of what
questions,
you're doing.
if you want to ask Sara questions about how her process works, or maybe you're looking for tips on how to use pencil in this medium, then drop those in the comments. We have a helpful moderator from explore.org looking for those today, so they'll be sharing those questions with us. We'll try to answer a few as we head along. And then I also want to encourage everybody to share their sketches with us. You can do that in the comments if you want to. Like if you're watching on explore.org, take a little photo, share it in the comments there. Or you can do so on social media using the hashtags drawn to explore and draw bear cam, or you can just send them to the email address feedback@explore.org. We'll be looking forward to those, and if you send them in, we'll maybe try to highlight a few of those during our next program. But that's in the future. So Sara, I think we wanted to talk about 856, a little bit
Mhm.
about him and that bear, because he is a bear that was part of my sort of formative bear watching years at Brooks River, and he's still a part of that story. I mean, he was the dominant bear here in 2012 when the bear cams went live, uh, and he's had a few ups and downs in recent years, but he was the river's most consistently dominant bear really throughout the entirety of bear cams history. Uh, a little bit about him first. He was identified as a young adult in 2006. So he was about 6 years old at that time. This means in summer 2025, he's in his mid 20s. And overall, he remains a huge bear. I estimate that he stands more than 5 feet tall at his shoulder when he's standing on all fours. And then in early summer, this is a great early summer photo of him, or a video of him here. He has some uniformly brown fur, but reddish tinges. He always seems to have light tips to his ears. In late summer, his newly grown fur is darker brown, but it also has some really grizzled highlights. And we'll get a look at that when we sketch him today. And then about his behavior, I mean, that's the thing that stands out to me. For most of his adult life, he's been Brooks River's most consistently dominant bear. And beginning in 2011, he became the river's most dominant bear, and he maintained that rank for most of the next 10 years. As he ages into a truly elder bear, he's facing increasing competition from younger bears who want to see the same advantages that 856 has procured for himself through his dominance. And then in last summer, 2024, he didn't seem capable of maintaining his hyper level of dominance like he had in the past. He was challenged by rivals like 747 and 32 Chunk. And because of that, he shifted his strategy. And this is where we saw his adaptability and wisdom at work. So he wasn't really confronting other bears like he had done in the past. And I think that really does speak to his adaptability and his longevity even, because his success is partly a product of that wisdom, his ability to adapt. He doesn't seem to pick fights that he can't win. And I think that's one reason why 856 has been so successful over so many years. And instead of fighting, like last year, he started to yield more and more. He waited, he became a bit more patient. This year, though, I think we're seeing him acting a bit and behaving a bit more assertively. He's been more willing to challenge bears like Chunk and other large adult males. So 856, I think, is feeling better this year than he was last year. He's certainly an awe-inspiring bear, Sarah. So, you know, I
Agreed.
think it's going to be fun for us to sketch. Why did you choose a photo of him as a model? Or excuse, maybe I should ask you more specifically, what photo of him did you choose, and why did you choose that one to
Well,
model?
well, for one, 856 is a lot to get into just one picture. We all know this guy has a lot of ups and downs and a pretty crazy history, especially from the time that both you and I have worked there, Mike, to now. So I wanted to kind of get the full breadth of him. He is a gigantic bear. I remember running into him on the Falls Trail a few times and being just like, whoa, having to get off and just realizing just maintaining like the size that he has, that he takes up like the presence of the entire trail as he goes by. And I wanted to make sure that we capture something like that. So instead of going for like a full front portrait, I thought we would do a profile of him today so that we see his entire body and just see it in motion in the water, doing his thing. And kind of like how you said earlier, how he's been kind of mellowing out a little bit more. I mean, I think that this photo was taken a year or two ago, but it gives the idea of the sense that he is still very much king in his head, and he is doing it regally by not having to really try. So one of the things that we're gonna do, like as we were watching him on the cam today, you kind of notice how the curve of his spine is, like where the inner shapes are. You want to look like where his weight kind of stands, because that's really directly correlates to where the angles are, and the way he kind of holds himself in general. So this is the kind of posture, like, and this is a general posture you'll see, as I'm sure we all have, as he's just kind of like trudging up the river, that I want to capture in today's drawing. So it's not just like what he is as a bear, but like what he is capable of and what he has been through, if that makes sense to you, Mike.
No, it does. Yeah. Yeah. You know, I think this is a great image of 856 because, like you said, it kind of captures him and in those moments where he's just like, I don't care who's in front of me, they're going to get out of my way. Like for such a long time, he had that confidence and he knew that he could go virtually everywhere that he pleases.
Mm.
It's different now. Again, we're fast forward a few years. It's a lot harder for him to compete, but he still is a very large bear. He's still fairly dominant at Brooks River. But I think this picture does capture, you know, basically 856.
Yes.
in his prime.
Very 856 picture. Yeah, very much so. So we can get started with our sketch. And so we'll be laying out the basic form of 856 using basic shapes. This is something that I've touched upon in the last year's season of Drawn to Explore, where we are looking at just the very basic shapes of starting to draw an animal or anything really. But, because bears are one of my favorite things to draw, they are very circular in nature. So that's where it's actually pretty fun. So I can find the really big circles of 856 here. So I'm starting with a pretty light leaded pencil to begin with. It's a 2H pencil. They're good for details and they are good for kind of laying out where we're going to start our general sketch, because really what we're putting in here are our guidelines, and we are going to rework this later. And I will say this a million times, I'm sure today, but it's all about trusting the process. And that's also about reminding myself that too. I do this every time, even though I've done this a million times too. It's all about trusting the process. So I went in and looked at his face, big circle where his shoulder meets his forearm, another giant circle, and then where his like giant side meets his like back hindquarters, another big circle. And then I start to go in and just like refine that a little bit more. So once you have those big basic shapes down, it's really helpful. And something I forgot to mention, that at the beginning of this drawing, I like to kind of put guidelines of like where I want the beginning of the bear to end and the end. So I usually make like just a tiny dot like towards like where his nose would be versus towards where his tail would be, just so that we're making sure that we're getting him all in on the composition, on the piece of paper that we are using. And those are just little telltale signs. And then after that, we go in and we start doing these circles like that. And then we're reworking them. Again, we have erasers. So that's, there's no reason that we can't use erasers. We're not back in my art school where I have a professor yelling at me saying I can't do that. Art is really easy to be able to erase, and it's very malleable. And we are in just the beginning stages here. And that's what we are doing just by putting in the shapes here and maybe connecting them a little bit line by line as we go. What do you think about that, Mike?
Yeah, I like it. I like the approach. I think that little tip that you gave about, basically making guidelines on your paper so you can capture the whole thing. Because I've made mistakes like that where I've been drawing something, a tree, whatever it happens to be, and then all of a sudden, like, oh crap, well, I can't, I can't fit the rest of what I want onto the paper because I wasn't paying attention to that. So, yeah, I love the idea of using pencil, just because pencil's like an accessible thing and it's forgiving too, especially if you use a light touch. You can get like a really hard pencil lead and you can grind it into your paper and you're going to have that mark there forever. But if you're using a light touch, like you're you're demonstrating in that video, I think that was another thing that I was able to realize, like, hey, this is something that uh, I if I make a mistake, it's cool. Like, it's cool to be messy. It's okay to make mistakes. You can
Every
just,
time.
kind of move on.
It really is. Yeah, yeah. I think sometimes, and I've mentioned this before, like a lot of stress, I think, is all when it comes to starting something like this. It's just like getting over that initial of like, oh, is it going to be perfect? It doesn't have to be. Because with this particular sketch with 856, I was approaching this more as like a field sketch. Like, so I wasn't sitting here taking, you know, 10 hours to go into the very specific details here. This is a technique that you would use that if you were actually in the field and trying to sketch something, this is how we're getting it down, the very primary information quickly. And this is something that maybe you could take back with you home, if you weren't able to obviously witness 856's presence in person, that you could rework later. Okay, so now that we've kind
Oh,
of
wait,
established, Mhm.
I was curious, before we get to the next video, what would you do if, let's say, you're watching camp footage, for example? Like, the thing with field sketching I've always had a difficult time with is the animals are moving around.
Mhm.
So, like, he wouldn't hold this position. Like, he would walk upstream and I'd be like, okay, I made one circle, then he sits down. I'm like, now what do I do? What's your approach there? Is it just practice, keeping practice that helps you maybe move on from just the basics even when the animals are moving?
Well, there's two things you can do. One is that you can have a camera,
Sure.
which everyone seems to have at Brick Falls anyway these days. So that's really, I mean, guilty as charged. I also take pictures. Another really good practice, and this is something that maybe we can explore in another show, is drawing a bear in motion too. So you can do it in a way where there's multiple lines to kind of give him the illusion of the fact that he is moving at the same time, which I think is also kind of a fun thing for a nature study because it gives you an actual vision of behavior. And that's something we can try and talk about too at a different time. But yeah, a lot of time it's repetition. This is something I always really liked about impressionist painters because their biggest thing was catching light at a very specific time of day, which obviously is very fleeting. And usually around golden hours. So they would go out at the exact same time at the exact day with that kind of dedication to go in and try and capture that presence in person. I mean, they didn't have things like the cameras and the phones and stuff, like the accessibility
Right.
that we have now. But think about like that kind of dedication to being in a place in nature. And I think something in that is very like therapeutic and connects you to this. So it's not necessarily worrying about having to get him in exactly that right moment. It's observing him to the point where you are so familiar with the way that we ID him and the way his body moves that you might be able to just like take a basic sketch like the one I just laid out earlier and be able to feed on that just from your imagination if you didn't want to use a photograph. But that's completely up to you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so we've just established the basic structure. So we're going to be building tone and form. So again, I am popping in here using my HB pencils. Um, I like to venture towards the B section side of the spectrum of the pencils as opposed to the H side because they're a little bit more malleable. But with the H's itself, they're good for detail. And this is one of my favorite and most satisfying parts, I would say, of drawing a bear or anything for that matter, is that I guess you go in there and start to actually erase the lines that makes it become one. So it doesn't just look like this like weird shaped piece of a bear that's been put together. Now he's starting to really come together. It's like, oh, I can recognize an actual outline of 856. So that's what we're doing here. And
Yeah,
I
you
also,
are
hmm,
you're it seems like you're purposefully leaving some of those original marks in there. So that's a choice that you're making. Like I want to be able to remember this contour, so I'm leaving
yes,
it in place.
exactly that. Yeah, I want to remember like some of where the shadows are, where maybe uh the fur pattern changes and stuff like that. So that's where, again, where I'm just kind of like leaving visual guidelines to remind myself of that. And again, it's not something that you necessarily have to do. It's easier for me, especially when I'm doing something, I'm challenging to do myself. Like make myself a field sketch where I'm drawing relatively quickly. It's all about putting those guidelines in now so that if I am missing what I'm seeing visually in front of me, then this will remind me where those shapes and colors and shadows were previously so that I can go back in and work on it again. And again, this we're lucky we're using a amazing photo today to be able to reference this, but for a field sketch, this is where it comes in handy to really make those like just shapes of where the shadows lie there. And then so I'm starting to go in here, and this is kind of where I bounce all over the place when I start putting in the layered shadows here. Starting again with a lighter lead, which ranges on more of the H side. I believe this is probably like a 2 or a 3B. And I went in with his face first because that's just where I like to start personally, from a satisfaction point, where I feel like if I get his face first, the rest of his giant body will follow. So I went in and put little spots where his nose is or where his mouth is. And I was really careful to really highlight his mouth, because I feel like 856's mouth can be pretty expressive sometimes. So I was trying to really make sure to like capture that and where his eyes were. And for this too, in the past I have said it's really important to like capture like the intensity and the depth of the eye. But here we don't even really need to do that. We're doing his whole profile. So it's more about capturing just the essence of where his eye is. And you're doing that by where the shadow is around the eye itself. So it kind of gives it the illusion that there is an eye there, as opposed to going into the details of the eye itself. And then when I went to go in and start drawing the ears, I left a little bit of negative space. And for those that are not familiar with that term, it just means space that I leave untouched, like with the white paper underneath. So that kind of creates the white itself, as opposed to me having to go re back in with a white piece of charcoal or paint. So you're kind of using the white below it to create the highlights. So you're keeping that in mind as you are drawing this. So I'm going back in again, and I'm trying to look at his fur patterns and to see where the shadows are, and I'm building upon that layer by layer there. A technique that I like to use when I'm doing this, especially the base layers, is using kind of the side part of the pencil. So I'm not holding the pencil just like straight on. I'm using the side part of it. And it gives a kind of a more of a wash, like under base illusion here. And because at the last step is where we're going to put the texture. You don't really want to put the texture in the beginning here, because we're really looking at more of the shadows and like highlights and stuff here. So the nice thing about this is that with these like kind of washes that I'm putting here, for lack of a better term, is that it creates like even strokes to create smooth planes. Because if you go too quickly, it kind of loses that like stillness in it. Graphite really rewards patience, which I actually struggle with sometimes. I love graphite. I am much more of a charcoal painter person. I like to get messy and all over the place, but with graphite, it really demands your attention to be precise. So you have to really think about it, which I think goes hand in hand again about really connecting with the piece that we are drawing. So it gives us more time to really look at 856 and his body and how he's all connected and his general overall presence. So it has like grit, but it also lets you kind of just erase and reshape a bit. You can like use your hand even for smudging a bit. And I think it's an ideal way for portraying 856, because he is just very much still him here, but we are also utilizing a technique that is allowed to build him to his full potential.
Looking at, this a bear like this too, uh, sketching helps us, I think, see a few of the things that maybe would be harder to notice. Because if we were to do a sketch of him and then a sketch of a young bear, let's say a cub or a subadult bear, we would see like their heads are just way different shapes. Like their ears would be much bigger in proportion to their head. And that was one of the things when I was doing my trying to get a head start on this process of sketching 856. I was like, okay, these ears are a lot smaller than I put them originally, so I had to go back and rework that, because adult bears have relatively small ears in proportion to the size of their heads. It seems like the ears kind of grow to full size well before their skulls reach their full size. We can see that in 856. His ears are set back pretty far in his skull. They're pretty wide set, but he always has those light tips to them. That's one of his ID characteristics. You always look for those light tipped ears, not as light as some bears, but he always seems to have that no matter what his fur color is, or the time of the year.
Yeah, agreed. And it's interesting for when I was taking illustration classes, especially when it came to drawing animals, and specifically, you would focus on things like when you're drawing like animals that are younger, or the same goes for humans too. You focus on like the things that they haven't grown into yet, right? So like the bigger ears or like the bigger eyes, because that kind of is the giveaway, biologically, that they are not an adult yet. So that is actually something that really comes into play when we are drawing animals that are cubs, or just younger in some capacity. But since he is a fully mature, grown adult male, we don't have to worry about that so much. So that's when you can actually tone this down, because if you were to give him like kind of the bigger ears, even though you feel like you should, because they look so big on the camera, that would give him kind of this illusion that he was a younger bear as opposed to an older bear, if that makes sense to you, Mike.
It does. It does actually. Yeah, and I like this image as well, like, or this photograph, because the light on 856 is interesting. Like, it's not flat light. It's not like an overcast day. It's a sunny day, but it was later in the season. So at Brooks River, like the sun is going to be coming from the south, so it's going to be, scooting across across the water and highlighting bears in different ways. In fact, I was curious, Sarah, we have an audience question we'll maybe try to get to in just
Yeah.
a second, but I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you this before. How does the light reflecting off of the water affect the appearance of 856's fur and shape um, in your sketch?
It's such a good question. It's something that comes up so often, especially even when I'm not just doing sketches, but if I'm doing like scientific illustration, because light really makes a huge difference in how color looks on a bear. So the way the light is shining on him here, it's really bringing out kind of like more of the foreground of his body as opposed to the back part. So we're seeing the light more on his face, on his ears, and just it's a lot of it's the reflection of the light off the water that we're seeing here on 856 and stuff, and it can change the entire color of it. So that's why it's important to more get like the shape and the general outline of him for his identifiable features, to make sure to be like, oh, that's 856, even if you're like, well, that doesn't make sense because his fur pattern doesn't always look that way. So how can that be 856? And it's about how the light is playing into it. So getting the rest of his more noticeable features is the important part here for this particular thing. But I always found it very interesting to see how light plays off animals, because it gives them more depth. And so with traditional scientific illustration, that's why you see birds, like birds, for example, like in a Sibley guide, like they are very basic colored. You don't have the illusion of the light shining on them. So you will see most illustrated guides in general having illustrations as opposed to photographs, because in photographs it captures the light, and that can actually throw off the ID of whatever it is that you're trying to ID. So we have more artistic license in this one particularly. So we're looking at just how it's interacting with his fur, and integrating it to him as a whole, as opposed to being like, oh, well, it's not 856 because of the way the light refracts. We're going to use the light refraction as a way to enhance the fact that it's still 856.
Yeah, I think this really shows in the color of the fur on his belly, because
Mm-hmm.
some of the other, especially if you look at bears in flat light, their stomachs are going to look pretty dark. But this one actually has the light coming basically from behind the photographer, bouncing off of the water and illuminating his underside. So that's a bit different than some of the other uh, images or photographs that you're going to see of bears that are taken under different conditions.
Definitely.
Yeah, and then
And
we have a. Sorry, go ahead.
oh, no, go for it, Mike.
Yeah, well, we had an audience question came
Sure.
in. You mentioned something about the eyes earlier. This is maybe a bit of a metaphysical question, but also a practical one that has to do with drawing. Somebody was wondering, Sarah, do you think bears have souls? If so, how do you capture the soul's essence in the bear's eye when you're drawing? Just touched on that briefly. In this sketch, it's maybe not as important to capture, the light reflecting off the eye. But I remember from last year when we were talking about this, you made a point to say, pick decide what angle the light is coming from, and make sure that you're capturing that in the eyeball.
Yeah, yeah. This is quite the existential question, which I'm sure I could go down a very long tangent on. But I do think that bears have presence, as we all know, right? And so even though we're not particularly focusing so much on the eye, which I do think invokes a lot of what an animal or a person is about. It's more about emphasizing where that eye is in relation to the rest of him. So it's not taking away from his personality so much. I mean, obviously, when you're doing a straight portrait of anything, that hits. That's why portrait paintings, photographies exist for a reason, because you're looking something dead in the face and you are really fully seeing who that is. We are doing this as more of a field sketch sort of technique and practice. So that's where the difference lies. But I still don't think it takes anything away from how powerful of a being that 856 is, just because of where the eye's placement is and where the rest of his body is. I mean, if we know about bear behavior and their stance and how they move and how they walk, I think that alone really brings his presence and his personality into this. So we don't have to worry so much about, oh, well, like I wanted to get the eye super perfect, because I know that that's one way to like really bring life to an image, which is true in a lot of ways. And it's actually one of my favorite things to draw when it comes to animals. But taking a step back here, how, if we were to take that out of the equation, what is the best way to portray an animal in its full presence and self without having to rely on just the eyes? And that's where I think his body and his stance here really comes into play. We can be like, oh, that's 856 just because I know that posture. I know that's the way like his ears kind of like go back a little bit and how he holds himself in the river.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think there's different ways that we can capture his dignity in a sense. And I do think animals certainly, I don't know if they have souls, but I know they have dignity in and of themselves. So, and that's something that we can capture, I think, even more by looking at shadows and highlights.
Yeah, definitely. So we will move into that next. So we're going to move into a little bit more shadow and a little bit more depth, which is more of my favorite thing to do because I do love my contrast. And I apologize, as I was filming this, I didn't realize my light had quite a glare on this. So just bear with me. No pun intended. Actually, very pun intended here. With the light on this, I was actually kind of standing and moving around, which also is a good practice for when you're sketching. It gives you a different perspective of what you're looking at. Sometimes even when I'm sketching, I will flip my paper completely upside down because it realigns like where the perspective and stuff is. It's just kind of a mind trick on you. So keep that in mind. But the way my light is reflecting on this, you're not going to get the full breadth of this, I think, until a few videos later and when you see the final result here. So what I'm going into here now doing is taking some of the softer leads again, which are more of my favorite because they're more malleable and then I can really get dirty with my hands, which is my favorite thing to do because I like to draw as more of a tangible experience where I'm using my hands to do it because it kind of gives me more of a connection and a feel of where the shapes are and where they are in relation to each other. So I'm also taking note of like where some of the negative space is on him too. Like I mentioned earlier, the negative space is just the white of the paper showing through here. And because if you use graphite, it's not that you can't erase it, but there will be some evidence of graphite there even if you did erase it. So if you're really trying to go for those punchy whites, and I still mess this up all the time too, so it's not the end of the world if you can't just leave that negative space there. You can use an eraser, but it's good to be mindful of where the highlights are, and you can always go back in and rework them. You know, less is more in that case where you're trying to capture the highlights to give him the full breadth and depth of what we're drawing here. So I was paying particular close note to where his fur patterns were. And this is what's really fun because I think it really starts to like make us fully look at bears because we're just starting to stare at things as close as their fur patterns, which I know a lot of us look at, but sometimes a lot of us take for granted because you're just not thinking about it. I mean, even when you have a dog, how often do you spend time looking at the fur patterns of your very own dog and how it shapes along its body. So that's something to keep in mind as we are drawing 856 here. And I'm not going in with full detail here yet. I'm still very much kind of just doing the wash part, and we're building a base here with layers. I'm looking for where the shadows are. I'm looking for like where his fur might be a little bit mottled, and it's cool to ask your questions like, why is his fur this way? Is it because he is just like swimming in the river and it moved it that way? Did he get in a fight? Was he rubbing up against something earlier? You know, fur patterns give away a lot of the behavioral aspect of a bear or any animal for that matter, because it is built in a certain way for that animal to move in the way that it does. So that is a good question to think about, especially as we're looking at this through an artist-naturalist lens. That fur pattern is not necessarily something to just be like, oh, I gotta draw all these tiny lines. Why is it like that? Why is the way that is? And I think about that a lot too when I'm drawing birds and feathers, because they're also very intentionally placed and directional. So that's what I'm doing here, still more just adding more of kind of like going darker and darker, using a heavier and a heavier B pencil. And I think like the ultimate B pencil I ended up using was like a 14B pencil. And again, it's not like you have to come in
14.
with these
I didn't even
tools.
know they made such a thing.
I didn't know either until I saw it, and I was like, I must have this. I must have this 14B pencil. And again, things you can find in art stores or online. And I want to make sure that the audience realizes that they shouldn't be intimidated by not having all these tools. I do this all the time, so I have probably more tools than I should because I have a problem when I go into art stores and I need to buy everything. But a lot of this stuff can really be done even if you just have a regular old like 2H pencil. It's just about how you're using the pressure on it, how you're using maybe the point versus the side of it for the sketching part, and like creating like an even wash versus using the point for more of the details. So remember, we're practicing this as a field sketch. So it doesn't necessarily have to be photorealistic or detailed. It's truly whatever you think kind of emotes 856 as being. And I think this is where the connection that we have with our subject comes into play. And it's not necessarily about like, oh, I have to be so perfect in this. It's like, how am I viewing 856 today, and kind of channeling that into what I'm doing. And that is the biggest takeaway, as I like to say, especially in these series, is it's not about perfection. It is about the process in which we are taking to make this come into reality. And I think that's what brings us closest to the subject that we are doing in anything really, but especially in nature, and especially in a subject that we particularly care about. So my personal style is I'm a little sloppy. I'm all over the place with my texture. Again, it's my personal style. And I think personally it gives him a little bit more dynamic here. So, I'm just like, I'll start in one spot, move to another spot, and then kind of bring it all together, whatever feels right. And something that's kind of called a flow state too, where you're not even thinking, you're just doing. And that's part of it. And I think when you're in that flow state, you can start to really kind of connect with the subject and give him more life and a little bit more dynamic movement there, even though it's a still painting or drawing in this case.
Well, I think that's one of the great things about sketching or painting or whatever is it does help to clear your mind. Like you were in that moment, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe there's not all the other, garbage that is happening in the world. You can kind of let that go for just a little bit. Sarah, I tried to get a little bit of a head today. Uh, in the past, I've started from scratch during the program, and I haven't been able to get very far except for like some circles. But I started before the program, and I've just been filling in a little bit
Oh,
at a
that looks
time.
awesome, Mike.
So say 5, 6 so far. Um, we did get an audience question coming in. Somebody was wondering though about um, proportions again, and that's something that I struggle with. Certainly, you've talked about it. Basically, every
Mhm.
time that we do this, you talk about
Yeah.
proportions and practicing that. So somebody was wondering, how do you make sure you draw the right length of the body? My sketch is too short.
I get, and it's always proportions. And you know what? This is not a linear process. I do this, I work with it every single time. I'm drawing something. Like proportions are something to very much pay attention to from the get-go. And a lot of times I like if it's helpful for people, you can use like a ruler if you really wanted to be like, okay, like if I'm looking at this picture, I'm taking this ruler, his shoulder hump is this many inches or centimeters away from where his like kind of more rear hump is, and maybe making the points based off of that as reference points. I am very much the cliched artist that does the like thumb, like where is that proportion and related to like where my thumb is, and these are something that you can kind of keep moving and moving together. And yeah, perspective and proportions are difficult. And this is where I think with the beginning sketches, it takes the most time to do that, to get it right. So before you kind of get into the more fun flow state of adding all of the shading, really pay attention to those proportions first, even if that means erasing, moving things a little bit closer together, and you'll slowly start to realize it. And something that I should have mentioned in the earlier video of just placing where the shapes are, something that's really helpful for me, like when I first started to do this, is that I would cut out actual shapes of like paper, and then I would place it over the picture to be like, where are the actual shapes on this? So like where is the circle from where his forearm towards his shoulder hump is, towards like where his hindquarters are, towards like where his face is. So different shapes like that you can kind of like put together, is helpful to maybe put over a photo or over the piece of paper that you're drawing. And again, this isn't cheating. This is just a different technique that might make it easier for you to start to feel more confident with just doing this more freehand. So that's probably one of the better advices I can give in terms of the proportion here. And it's easy for things to like look off a little bit, but again, it's just think really this is observation skills in play. Look so closely at this bear that you're going to know him so well that you know that his shoulder hump is only like this far from where his ears are. And that's what I find so great about doing drawing from nature, because it really, really forces us to look at our subject in a way that we probably wouldn't otherwise.
And you mentioned this before, but can you reiterate what pencil you ended up gravitating more than another? Somebody was asking, what pencil are you using now for the fur? And I think this question came in when we were watching the last video.
Well, I'll be using a few, especially as we go into our last video. But it's a mixture of where his face is specifically, because it's smaller and I want to make sure that there is still detail there without being like too smudgy, because then that can kind of muddle up where the fine details are that I really want to invoke. 856's presence is where I'll use more of a harder pencil. So like, like a 2H or something, an H or a 2H is where I will do that. And then as we move into our final videos here, I am actually using a much darker, like 14B crazy pencil. I don't know how well you can see this because I have my background down, but yeah, it's a big, thick guy right there. And that really, I'll sharpen it to a super fine point, and that's where I'll start to just like get wild and do my like crazy little dot streaks of fair texture for there. And you don't have to like get super wound up on it. I think it's more about, in this case specifically, since we're not going for photorealism, we're going for more of a nature sketch, that we're giving more of the idea of 856. Which I think is pretty cool to be able to capture a presence such as 856 in very specific, quick ways that is still very recognizable.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's still a little bit more work to be done with your field sketch, at least, Sarah.
Mhm.
So, how do you approach the final details?
Yeah, so we're gonna jump in and kind of do some of the final slight smudges of the graphite to kind of give it more of an atmosphere. And I also decided to go in with this too and just add a little bit of environment around his feet so he wasn't just floating in space. And sometimes I like to just have him floating in space, but this one was just kind of cool because it gives him that sense of like we've all seen 856 just like slowly trudging, like making his presence known up the river. We're all just like, here he comes. Well, what's gonna happen? So I liked to bring that into this particularly. And so just it's just a little bit of a river around his feet, and that's just like some little like swirls just to show the drag of his body and the drag of his legs as he's moving forward here. So I am using again more of these bee related pencils here, the graphite, and layering and layering a little bit more of where his shadows are. And so, you know, the bear obviously should remain the focus in all of this, even if you want to do the environment, which I think is cool too. And you know, when you're doing like a full-blown composition piece, that is adding the environment is very important, but it is important to make sure that it's not taking away from the actual composition focus itself. So that's why I did it very subtly here, with adding those sort of like river strokes in there. So it's not, I like to work with this like deep contrast with 856. So or in general, I am a contrast person. I really like highlights. I really like shadows. I think it really gives depth. And 856 is definitely a bear that requires depth. So I am not afraid to go dark. So press down on that pencil. Don't be afraid to do it. And I think it's going to add a lot more gravity to what you're doing and really bringing him out as opposed to like more of a soft sketch here. So please, yeah, feel again, not it's just be natural in whatever feels best for your own style, but don't be afraid to press a little bit harder and really try and bring out some of like where those dark spaces are, especially like looking at the dark hump on his back there.
Yeah, and I like what you did with the water there. I, water always I think adds a layer of depth to whatever subject you're producing. If it happens to be a water sketch or a water-based animal, something like that. Uh, you mentioned that you don't always include, the setting. Sometimes maybe it's appropriate to have things sort of like floating um, in space. I wonder, like in a future episode of this, if we should do something that we just do like a water sketch or a wave sketch. I think
Yeah.
when you look at the reference photo of A56 too, like where he's placing his left leg. I mean, you could see how he's basically creating sort of like a pocket in the water there. It's a really neat sort of like feature.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe would need its own techniques and its own way to kind of capture the motion of the water itself. Because
Very, very much so. Yeah, drawing water is both tricky but also so rewarding because then you really have to look at shapes and you really have to look at details and you don't realize how much shapes and details are in water that requires it to give you that water appearance. And so yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion. We should try doing that maybe in the future if we're drawing maybe like a salmon and like a half underwater scene and we can experiment a bit with how light refracts through water and gives it that water look because it's not always easy. It's not just like drawing like a one big thing of blue, right? Because that takes away from like the depth and the obvious fluidity that is water, and how easy it is to move through. And I mean, even in this sketch and this picture itself, 856 becomes a part of the water because he is maneuvering the way the river is even rushing past him. So that in itself, I think, is a pretty cool connection to think about.
any other final words of advice for finishing up field sketches or thoughts on 856 and this his reference photo or how it translated onto paper?
Yeah, yeah. So another thing too, and that I kind of missed like in this last video is that it's you can always go back in and use an eraser to really bring out the kind of like final highlights here, which is what I did. You can kind of see if I can show you on my poster on my face. There we go. Little eraser. I like to use this one to just go in and kind of briefly swipe like where some of the more poppy highlights are. So kind of like if we look where his ear is, like right behind it, there's like kind of a bright blonde patch. Just before it, there's a little bit of a bright blonde patch, like where his muzzle is, blonde patch. So I'll go in and do that to kind of bring the contrast out. And not only is this just my personal style because I enjoy high contrast in the work that I do, I think it also helps give the viewer the idea of how the light plays off an animal. And, bears can be tricky to draw. I mean, we look at them and then we're like, that bear is brown and there's nothing else to it. But there's so many layers of brown and varieties of brown and gradients of brown, and it really makes you appreciate the him as a whole. He's a very complex animal as well as just his physical complexities as well. So using an eraser to kind of bring that out a little bit, I think is what adds to making 856 as the powerful boar that he is.
Well, he's certainly, taught us that strength doesn't always mean dominance. It can mean changing your approach, and through pencils and through graphite, we've explored how his mass and shadow can speak loudly to us. So I love the sketch, Sarah. I'm going to try to maybe work on mine a bit more over the next week or so, and maybe we can share it next
Please
time.
do. Please
Uh,
do.
there's uh, kind of one final question that we had coming in. Um, Actually, we had two questions coming in. Real quick, Sarah, before we conclude, somebody was wondering, Ava, age 11, wrote in and said, I really like realistic art, but I'm often feeling more like drawing a cartoon or comic style. Do you have any tips for maybe changing styles, but still having it look like the bear?
So really into realistic art, but more of a drawing a cartoon style. Yeah, I think this is a really good technique for things like markers or pens. I think it's helpful for that because you're not doing quite as the in-depth like layering. I mean, you do layering, but not as much. So I would look into something like that as a medium first. And usually when you're doing a cartoon style, you're relying a lot more on just like line and line work in this because the lines are really going to be directing the movement here. And so I think that's where it really differentiates between like a comic style versus a more realistic version. When I am doing more of like my digital art, like some of the birds that you see behind me, which I mean, yes, they do have like a realism version to it, but they are definitely more of a graphic um uh technique here. So you're doing more of like color blocks as opposed to shading so much for my technique specifically. And again, for each person, this is different. There's a lot of tutorials out there too that'll really help walk you through this a little bit better as well. But I would recommend maybe investing in some different markers that come in a variety of washes and start using those and focusing more on the physical lines as opposed to really getting into the nitty-gritty details of the realistic drawing that we're doing here today.
Well, thanks for sharing all of that information, Sarah. Is there a place where people can find uh, other artwork that you've done?
Yeah, well, you can go on our YouTube channel. We have a Drawn to Explore channel, so you can see on there where all of the other shows that we've been doing, and then we will be doing quite a few more as well throughout the season. We have, I think, about 10 or so more planned, so stay tuned for that. And yeah, in general too, if you were interested in seeing some of the work that I do, you can do kind of a quick Google search. I do a lot of work when I'm not doing work for Explorer. I do a lot of work relating around climate change and bird migration and how we work ourselves through climate change and how that can be a really emotive way to express ourselves like through art. So feel free to Google stalk me, guys. I'm out there somewhere. It does have my information out there. But in the meantime, if you want to see more tutorials and slow these down, because obviously a lot of these videos are sped up, so to take your time, go on to explore.org and on our YouTube channel and look up Drawn to Explore.
And what do we have in store for the next one? I think that's coming up in early August.
Yes, yeah. On August 4th, I believe, we are going to be doing an illustration of Grazer, one of my favorites. So we're going to be doing that with watercolor, with pen and ink, which I think will be really fun because we'll be able to play a little bit with color and then with a little bit of like a fun scribble with different pens. And I'm actually going to be using pens that a lot of graphic artists use because they're very flowy and they're like fun to use. So that'll be a fun one to look forward to coming up. And that'll
Well,
be in
great.
2 weeks, I believe, on
Yes.
yes, August 4th.
Well, looking forward to it. And thanks again, Sarah, for joining me today. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I always enjoy this, and I'm so glad that you draw along with me, Mike. Your stuff is awesome too.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Sara Wolman for joining me once again. Sarah is an artist, does a lot of work for explore.org. Keep sketching and observing the world around you, because throughout our shared history, humanity has used art as a means to connect with and better understand nature. As with all of our live events, a replay of this chat will be available on explore.org's YouTube channels. So thanks again for watching. Thanks for joining me. My name is Mike Fitz with explore.org. And as we like to say here, never stop learning.